Hold on tight. This tale hits like a cold iron brand. Today I'm telling you about a girl who stared down the meanest kind of future and said, "Not today," right in the frozen heart of 1930s New York, where blizzards don't care who they bury and abandoned estates keep secrets colder than the grave. It kicked off with one reckless, heart-pounding moment. A 14-year-old orphan forcing open a basement window and walking straight into the jaws of a storm, rather than let strangers decide the rest of her days. That one frozen step was all it took to crack open a miracle nobody believed possible. Before we follow her trail any deeper, give this video a like if you're already leaning in, and tell me in the comments. Where you at right now? Hudson Valley, New York. February 1936. While the other girls at Greystone Orphanage for lost daughters curled tight under thin blankets, shivering against the wind that sliced through broken window panes, 14-year-old Zephyr Vale was already squeezing through a narrow basement window, stepping straight into the teeth of a howling snowstorm. She carried nothing but a pilfered wool coat and a fire in her chest that refused to let her settle for the life waiting inside those cold brick walls. Behind her, the hulking orphanage stood like a dark fortress under the slate-gray sky. Every window was black except one, the matron's office, where the papers sealing Zephyr's fate had already been stamped and filed. Come morning, she'd be loaded onto a wagon bound for Albany, handed over to the Vesper clan as a housemaid. Schooling done. Dreams of anything bigger crushed down to a lifetime of scrubbing floors and cooking for strangers. That afternoon, Prudence Rook, the iron-fisted matron, had delivered the verdict with the thin smile she mistook for mercy. "You ought to count your blessings, Zephyr. The Vesper folks are decent people. You'll have a roof, 3 squares a day. Plenty of girls in your shoes would thank the Lord for such a chance." But Zephyr felt no gratitude. Only bars closing around her. She had spent 9 long years inside those walls, dreaming of open sky and living green things. She'd devoured every tattered book she could sneak about soil and seeds, about roots pushing through hard earth, picturing a life spent coaxing life from dirt instead of wiping someone else's silver clean. Tomorrow, that vision would be buried forever. She'd become exactly what Greystone had always planned. Invisible, obedient, her spark snuffed out before it could catch. If you're curious how a runaway orphan stumbled onto a forgotten glass palace on a derelict spread and raised crops no book-learning scientist believed could survive a New York winter, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're writing from. Because what Zephyr Vale built inside those fogged panes didn't just save her. It rewrote the rules of growing food where the ground stays frozen half the year. Greystone had been Zephyr's whole world since she was 5, when consumption stole her mother in a charity ward and her father simply walked off into the night, too broke to keep her and too broken to look back. She held only scraps of memory from before. A cramped tenement, thick with the smell of her mother's stew, a flower box blooming against the summer heat, a soft voice reading tales by lamplight. Those fragments had kept her alive through 9 years of gray routine, proof that warmth had once been real and might be again, if she could claw her way back to it. Greystone wasn't outright mean, but it was mercilessly practical. No space for fancy notions. It ran like a workhouse assembly line, turning out girls drilled in every chore rich households demanded of their cheapest help. Cooking, scrubbing, mending, ironing, the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept fine homes running. Anything beyond reading signs and counting coins was deemed a waste for girls destined for service. Prudence Rook ran the place like a cattle boss, judging success by how many girls she shipped out to respectable positions, never once asking what those girls might have dreamed for themselves. Zephyr had figured out young that her hunger for plants, for learning the secrets of dirt and sun and rain, had no place in Greystone's ledger. Those hopes were quietly smothered, steered toward more useful skills, labeled childish daydreams that growing up would soon kill off. She'd only had 2 days to plan after Prudence announced the Vesper placement. She'd almost talked herself into surrendering. Told herself service might not be so bad, that she could steal moments to tend a kitchen patch, that putting dreams on hold didn't mean burying them forever. But deep down, something wild refused to bend. She was 14, strong, sharp, stubborn as barbed wire. She couldn't swallow the idea that strangers who'd never bothered to ask her name had already carved her whole life in stone. That night's blizzard felt like a sign carved in wind and ice, an opening that might never come twice. She'd packed what little she could carry, eased through the basement window she'd scouted during chores weeks earlier, and stepped into the swirling white nothing. No map, no plan, only the bone-deep certainty that she'd rather die free in the dark than live caged in someone else's kitchen. The world outside Greystone might chew her up, but at least it held chances the Vesper household could never offer. The storm that had felt like an accomplice while she schemed turned traitor the moment she was in its jaws. Snow lashed her face, wind knifed through the stolen coat, cold sank into her marrow inside the first hour. She clung to the road she'd memorized, but every familiar marker was swallowed by drifts. The whole world looked the same. Endless white. By midnight, the road was gone. She staggered blind through knee-deep powder, praying she was still heading right. Feet numb blocks, hands screaming inside gloves that had felt warm enough back in the cellar but were useless now. Then a wall slammed into her. Stone, sudden and solid. Her frozen fingers traced it, following blindly, hoping it led somewhere that wasn't death by cold. What felt like hours, though it was likely minutes, brought her to a rusted iron gate. One hard shove and the bars gave way with a groan. Beyond it, a snow-buried drive climbed toward a massive shape half lost in the gale, a dark hulk of a house that at least promised to break the killing wind. The place turned out to be a sprawling mansion, long forsaken, its towering walls dark and many windows shattered like broken promises. The once proud front entrance lay choked under drifts of debris piled up over forgotten years. Zephyr didn't even bother testing the main doors. She knew empty houses like this were usually locked tight or boarded up, even when no living soul claimed them. Instead, she moved slowly around the edges of the building, hunting for a servant's door, a cracked cellar window, anything low enough to crawl through and escape the wind that was trying to kill her. Then she found something far better. Tucked behind the mansion, linked by a sagging, snow-burdened walkway that had half caved in under the weight of many winters, stood a strange glass cathedral, unlike anything she'd ever laid eyes on. Almost every inch of it was paneled in glass, fogged, streaked, but whole. The interior was dark, yet some stubborn warmth lingered inside, a faint defiance against the murderous cold outside. A greenhouse, that's what it had to be. She pushed on the door. Rusty hinges screamed in protest, but the latch gave. Zephyr staggered across the threshold and felt the air change at once, not truly warm, but blessedly less cruel. The storm's roar dulled to a muffled howl. Glass walls and roof trapped what little heat there was, holding it close even without a fire. She crumpled to the floor among overturned pots, empty planters, and the brittle skeletons of plants that had once made this place alive. Exhaustion hit her like a hammer. She slept the deep, black sleep of someone who no longer cared whether dawn ever came, because stopping, just stopping, mattered more than breathing another minute in that killing wind. When she woke, pale winter light was leaking through the grimy panes. She was still alive, and, miracle of miracles, still relatively warm. Daylight revealed the truth. The greenhouse was enormous, far bigger than the darkness had let her guess. A whole maze of connected glass rooms stretched across nearly half an acre, pressed tight against the mansion's south wall to steal every scrap of low winter sun. The heart of it was a long, wide hall, maybe 80 feet by 40, with a high-peaked roof soaring 30 feet at the ridge, tall enough for full-grown trees. Wings branched off on either side, smaller chambers built for different purposes, some lined with potting benches, others with deep soil beds, still others fitted with mazes of pipes and valves whose purpose Zephyr didn't yet understand. The place was battered. Cracked and missing panes let in drafts. Iron frames were eaten with rust. Wood had rotted black. Yet the bones of the structure held strong. Most important of all, the old heating system. Pipes running everywhere, feeding from a coal boiler buried in the mansion's basement, still looked like it might be brought back to life. When this place was new, that boiler had been cutting edge, pumping tropical heat through New York winters. Back at Greystone, Zephyr had been forced through basic repair lessons: how to mend a leaky pipe, clear a flue, keep a stove from smoking. She'd hated every minute, knowing those skills were meant to make her a better servant. Now those same lessons felt like gifts she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. They might just turn this ruined glass palace into something she could survive in. Over the next weeks, as she crept through the frozen estate, Zephyr pieced together the story. The mansion and grounds had once belonged to Thaddeus Flint, a railroad baron who'd made a fortune laying iron across the frontier. In his later years, he poured piles of money into a private obsession, collecting strange and beautiful plants from every corner of the world. This greenhouse had been his treasure vault, staffed by expert gardeners who battled New York winters to keep delicate tropicals alive. Flint died in the Great Flu of 1918. His heirs wanted nothing to do with his costly hobby. They shut the gates, let the staff go, turned off the heat, and left the exotic plants to freeze. For almost 18 years, the glass complex had stood empty, slowly breaking down, but never quite falling apart. The sturdy Victorian engineering had outlasted neglect that would have crushed anything less stubbornly built. In a small gardener's cottage near the greenhouse, she found the records: journals, ledgers, catalogs listing hundreds of species that had once thrived here. More precious still were the seeds, thousands of them, sealed in glass jars and paper packets, each one carefully labeled in Latin with notes on soil and light and water. Whoever had packed them away had done it right. Moisture and wild temperature swings hadn't reached them. Sure, many were probably dead after 18 years, but some might still live. And the bare possibility of waking Thaddeus Flint's lost garden gave Zephyr something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Purpose. Survival was no longer just about not dying. It was starting to feel like the beginning of something bigger. Heat was the first wall she had to climb. On sunny days, the greenhouse drank in sunlight, the thick stone walls and deep soil beds holding that warmth like a bank, releasing it slowly through the long, bitter nights. But passive solar alone would never keep true tropicals alive. It wouldn't even keep a half-frozen teenage girl alive through a Hudson Valley winter. The coal-fired boiler down in the mansion basement was the obvious answer, but coal cost money Zephyr didn't have. And even if she could scrounge some, lighting that big fire would send smoke rolling into the sky, smoke that would draw eyes she could not afford to have looking her way. For weeks, she studied the heating network, tracing every pipe, every valve, learning how the system had once worked. It was far cleverer than she'd first thought. It hadn't just kept the whole place warm. It had created little worlds inside the glass, hot zones for true jungle plants, cool pockets for species that needed a rest period, middle zones for everything in between. The same complexity that once demanded a full crew of gardeners now became her secret advantage. She didn't have to heat the entire half-acre. She only had to keep one small corner alive. She chose a side room, maybe 15 feet square, originally used for starting seedlings. Its glass was still mostly intact, its seals tight, its connection to the old pipe network still solid. She patched every gap and fissure she could reach with whatever scraps she scavenged: old rags, broken boards, daubs of mud mixed with pitch. Then rigged up a rough little wood stove from salvaged sheet metal, bricks, and an old barrel she found rusting in the carriage house. She fed it nothing but downed limbs and deadfall dragged in from the overgrown acres that surrounded the place like a wild frontier. No fancy coal, no bought fuel, just free timber from the tangled woods that had once been manicured lawns. Spring crept in slow and stubborn, the days stretching longer, the sun climbing higher, pouring more light and warmth through the glass, even without her stove burning round the clock. Zephyr started her first real trials with Thaddeus Flint's hidden seed hoard. She picked out the ones the old journals claimed might stand a chance in cooler weather, sowing them in fresh mixed beds she'd built by blending soil from every corner of the greenhouse maze. Plenty never stirred. Years locked away had stolen their spark, or the conditions just weren't right. But a few broke ground, fragile green tips nosing up through the dark earth like tiny flags of defiance after nearly 20 years of silence. Those first sprouts she guarded like gold, watering with a careful hand, feeding with bits of compost she brewed herself, shielding them from the sudden chills that still swept through at night. Every day she learned the greenhouse's moods, how to read its breath and keep it steady. She blundered plenty, drowned roots with too much water, let others parch, exposed tender leaves to a frost she hadn't seen coming. Each dead plant taught her something the faded pages couldn't. Come summer, she counted maybe 50 living things in different stages of growth. A small handful compared to the thousands Flint once tended, but proof enough that resurrection was possible. If she could lick the heat problem for one more winter, this glass world could breathe again. The breakthrough came from the last place she expected, a simple heap of rotting scraps. At first she started composting just to get rid of kitchen leavings and dead leaves from her tiny living space. Then it hit her. The slow burn of decay gave off real heat. Old-time farmers had known it for generations, piling manure and straw into hotbeds to jumpstart seedlings before the ground thawed. She'd skimmed the idea in Flint's journals, but never grasped how big it could go. She dove in, building test piles from every scrap she could haul: fallen leaves, rotted fence posts, kitchen peelings, anything organic the estate offered. She poked a thermometer she'd found in the gardener's shack into the heart of each one, watching, waiting, noting which mixes roared hottest and held it longest. The numbers stunned her. A well-made pile could hold steady above 140 degrees for weeks on end, hot enough to throw real warmth into the air around it, enough to matter even when blizzards howled outside. She built more piles, scattering them through the greenhouse like hidden campfires, then rigged simple ducts and vents from salvaged tin and pipe to pull that heat where she needed it. No coal bills, no telltale smoke, just free forest fodder she gathered by the armload. The setup wasn't pretty. It demanded constant tending. Old piles cooled, new ones had to rise in their place, and the whole place carried a rich, damp earth smell that might turn some folks' stomachs. But it worked. Cold, hardy plants stayed cozy even on the meanest winter nights. That freed her to spread out far beyond the reach of her little wood stove, claiming more of the glass empire inch by inch. The first stranger showed up in the spring of 1938, 2 full years after Zephyr had staggered in half dead, convinced the cold would claim her before morning. His name was Doc Jedediah Crow, a botany professor from a college downriver. He'd been friends with Thaddeus Flint way back when, and whispers had reached him that somebody was squatting on the old Flint spread. He rode out braced for trouble, Maybe desperate Dust Bowl families or hobos riding the rails, the kind of folks the Depression had scattered everywhere. He was ready to fetch the law if need be. What stopped him cold in the greenhouse doorway for a solid 5 minutes was nothing like that. The place he remembered as a frozen tomb was breathing again, alive with leaves and vines and blooms that had no business thriving this far north. And tending them was a girl who couldn't be past 16, talking plant science with the calm certainty of a scholar twice her age. Zephyr had braced herself for this day. She knew someone would come eventually. She'd practiced her story in the quiet hours, calm words that might buy her time without hauling her back to Greystone or clapping irons on her for trespass. But Doc Crow didn't ask about papers or warrants. His eyes were on the green life she'd raised, on the tricks she'd invented to make it happen, on what it all meant for growing food where winters bite deep. A question that had haunted his work for decades. What started as a wary meeting grew into something solid. The professor brought things Zephyr could never reach on her own. Fresh seeds, rare cuttings, books, connections. More than that, he had the pull to shield her from the law, got her papers filed as an independent minor doing work that helped the greater good, so no orphanage wagon came rolling up the drive. In return, he got a living experiment no university could match, a real-world proving ground for cold country growing theories, and a partner whose hands-on know-how outstripped any PhD he'd ever taught. They wrote papers side by side, her name right there next to his in journals that would have laughed at an unlettered orphan girl. They stood up at farm conferences. At first her knees shook, speaking to crowds, but she found her voice when she saw folks lean in, hungry for what she knew, no matter where it came from. Together they pushed the greenhouse farther, brought more of Flint's old sections back to life, tested plants that laughed at the experts' limits for New York soil and sky. By 1940, Zephyr had done what the doubters swore was impossible. By 1940, Zephyr had pulled off a feat that left Doc Crow's university colleagues shaking their heads in disbelief until they rode out and saw it for themselves. She was raising citrus right there in the Hudson Valley, orange and lemon trees not just clinging to life through the brutal winters, but bearing real, ripening fruit while the world outside lay locked under snowdrifts. She'd pieced together her system like a frontier homesteader cobbling together a claim. Passive solar catching every low ray through the glass, compost heaps breathing steady heat from decay, thick stone walls and barrels of water hoarding warmth like a banker hoards gold, and razor-sharp control over tiny pockets of climate inside the structure. The citrus claimed the hottest corner, where pipes, compost vents, and sun trap converged to hold the mercury steady above 50 degrees, even when blizzards raged. The fruit came out smaller than the fat Florida or California oranges folks bought in stores, but it was honest-to-God fresh, picked ripe in the dead of winter from trees that every textbook swore couldn't survive this far north. Word of Zephyr's citrus spread like wildfire through farm circles and lecture halls, genuine new ground being broken. Skeptics showed up with arms crossed and left with hats in hand, their hard-set ideas about what cold country could grow cracked wide open forever. Then the war rolled in, bringing hardship and a strange kind of luck neither Zephyr nor Doc Crow had seen coming. With ships sunk and trains tied up hauling troops, long-haul food became scarce and expensive overnight. Local growing wasn't just nice anymore. It was vital, the way it had been before railroads and steamers made distant harvests cheap. What started as a quirky research patch turned lifesaver. Through the lean winter months when green things vanished from markets, the greenhouse pumped out fresh greens, herbs, root crops, food that tasted like hope when rations ran thin. Zephyr pushed hard. She tore out showy flower beds to make room for food rows, fine-tuned ways to squeeze every ounce of yield from the heated space, and showed local volunteers how to build their own small setups back home. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945 and store shelves started filling again, Zephyr had earned her place as the go-to voice on growing year-round, where winters bite deep. No fancy degrees hung on her wall. Her standing came from plain proof. Walk through the glass doors and see the impossible growing green under your boots. The old Flint estate, a ghost town when she first stumbled in, had become a regional landmark. Farmers, scientists, plain folks curious about miracles, they all made the trek to witness what couldn't be done, yet was. The mansion itself stayed empty, too costly to fix up, too big for what she needed. All the life centered on the glass wings out back. But those had been brought back shining. Victorian bones strengthened with smarter vents, better seals, modern tweaks that boosted output without erasing the graceful lines Thaddeus Flint once paid dearly for. Folks walking the paths often stopped and stared at the contrast, the crumbling stone giant looming dark against the bright, thriving green inside the glass, and felt something wordless stir. Decay on one side, stubborn new life on the other. Zephyr kept at it for another 50 years. Her ways fanned out across the cold belts of North America, then crossed oceans to harsher lands still. She taught hundreds, apprentices who went on to raise their own glass houses, stringing together a web of winter-proof food patches that changed how northern towns ate through the lean months. Big growers picked up her tricks and shipped fresh goods to East Coast cities. Colleges turned her greenhouse into a living classroom. Aid groups carried the methods to frozen corners of the world, feeding people who'd once depended on boats from far-off tropics. She advised governments, companies, charities, always with the same rule: share it wide and free, never fence it behind paywalls for profit. She never forgot she'd built everything from cast-off land and open books anyone could read. Her own books became Bibles for farm folks, plain-spoken guides that broke down hard science so a man with dirt under his nails could follow and succeed. The clean, straightforward way she'd taught herself to write in Flint's old gardener shack carried straight into print. Farmers without college letters could pick up her pages and put them to work, spreading know-how that might otherwise have stayed trapped in thick journals read only by professors. Awards came, plaques, honors, titles, from the same schools and societies that once called her claims nonsense and her methods wild. To the half-frozen girl who'd pried open a basement window one February night, it all would have sounded like a tall tale. She never lost sight of her roots. She stayed close in spirit to the cast-aside, the overlooked, the ones the world wrote off. Over the decades, the greenhouse hired dozens of young hands, many runaways, orphans, kids the system or families had thrown away like bad seed. She paid fair wages, taught solid skills, and set plenty of them up with their own plots so they could stand tall and build something real. A good number rose to become known names in Northeast farm circles, every step of their rise tracing back to the confidence and know-how they gained under her watchful eye. She kept letters flowing with them for life, cheering their wins, talking them through rough patches, weaving a quiet network bound by the same creed: grow more than crops, grow people's chances too. The nearby townsfolk, who'd once eyed the old Flint place with dark suspicion, came around slow but sure. They started seeing it as their own quiet point of pride. Winter baskets of fresh vegetables reached kitchen tables when nothing green should have been possible. School kids tromped through on field trips, wide-eyed, learning how plants could live, how warmth could be made where cold ruled, how life could push back against the hardest seasons. The greenhouse gave young folks steady work right there in the valley. No need to pack up and chase city lights or factory whistles just to scrape by. It turned into the heart of the community, a warm, green refuge where folks gathered for barn dances, harvest suppers, weddings, and holiday sing-alongs under swaying palms and blooming vines. Those tropical walls offered sweet escape from the bone-chilling winds, and the riot of growth made every celebration feel like a story folks would tell their grandkids for decades. In 1958, the Greystone Orphanage for Girls finally shuttered its doors, replaced by brighter, more hopeful places that actually gave kids a real shot at something better. Zephyr caught the news in a folded newspaper one quiet morning and felt a tangle of feelings rise up. Pure relief that no other girl would be funneled straight into a life of scrubbing and serving, mixed with a strange, reluctant thanks to the grim old building that, however poorly, had kept her fed and breathing long enough to break free and build her own world. Prudence Rook had stepped down years before that. Word reached Zephyr that the old matron spent her last days quietly tending a patch of flowers and vegetables behind her daughter's house, finally finding some peace in the very earth she'd once dismissed as unfit for the girls in her charge. Zephyr made the trip back for the closing ceremony. She stood inside those familiar brick walls where she'd spent 9 long years plotting her escape, and all she felt was quiet hope that the young ones who followed would walk out into wider horizons than she'd ever been allowed to dream of. Zephyr Vale passed on in 2003 at 81, slipping away peacefully in her sleep inside the modest cabin she'd built with her own hands right next to the greenhouse that had been her true home for 67 years. Hundreds turned out for her send-off, farmers with calloused hands, researchers with notebooks, former apprentices who'd started their own spreads, and everyday neighbors who said her work had changed how they saw what was possible. The glass complex she'd nursed back from ruin now sprawled over more than 3 acres, looked after by the non-profit she'd set up so the work would carry on long after she was gone. Her cold climate growing methods are at work in thousands of places around the globe, putting fresh food on tables for millions who'd otherwise wait on trucks rolling in from distant sunshine states. Her books still sit on shelves, dog-eared and trusted, the go-to guides for anyone wanting to stretch seasons or coax plants beyond their old maps. The rare varieties she rescued and multiplied live on in seed vaults and gardens worldwide, genetic treasures that would have vanished forever without her stubborn hands. All of it springs from a 14-year-old girl who slipped out an orphanage window one February night with only a borrowed coat and a heart that refused to quit, never dreaming the trail she'd blaze. Her life stands as a hard, clear truth. Every person the world writes off as trouble, as excess baggage, as someone with dreams too big for their place, carries a spark that can light up the dark, if given half a chance. Greystone pegged her as a rebel who needed breaking. The outside world saw a runaway who needed corralling back into line. Nobody looked close enough to see the iron will, the sharp mind, the fierce hunger to make something real. That greenhouse wasn't just shelter from the storm. It was the wide-open range where everything they'd tried to stamp out in her became pure strength. Her endless questions, her lone wolf streak, her flat refusal to swallow, "That's impossible." Those were the very things Prudence Rook had tried to grind down, and they were exactly what let her outgrow every expert who said it couldn't be done. The plants she raised weren't just pretty specimens. They were living proof that hidden promise waits in the roughest ground, that life will push through stone if someone bothers to learn what it truly needs instead of nodding along to what folks say it can't have. So here's the question that lingers like smoke from a far-off campfire. What untapped fire is burning in the so-called troublemakers around you? The ones dismissed as problems, as dreamers too big for their britches. What could they build if they found their own patch of glass and good earth, a place where their rough edges turn into tools instead of thorns? And what about you? What gifts have you buried because someone called them flaws? What strengths are waiting for the right, wide-open space to break free? Zephyr Vale was 14, orphaned, bruised, staring down a future meant to crush her spirit. She ran into a forgotten greenhouse and raised wonders nobody believed possible, not because fate handed her silver spurs, but because she stared down every can't and said, Watch me. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.